When we look around and see the political structures around us, see the kind of governments, the states that are functioning, sometimes it's not such a bad idea to question these things. Where do they come from? What's the underlying philosophy? And philosophically speaking, are they good for us? What are they meant to do? And when we raise these questions, inevitably we are led to the point when we start questioning that who decided these things, who did all the thinking behind it, who were the brains. And then we are taken back to the Enlightenment age when people like John Locke or Thomas Hobbes, they were doing these discussions. And that's why in today's podcast I'm talking about Thomas Hobbes, the 17th century philosopher who pretty much created the political science subject as we know today. And if you haven't read anything about Thomas Hobbes, let me start with the point that his ideas were radical, absolutely radical. And because of that, he lived in this constant fear of persecution. In fact, when he was in France, he got into trouble for his anti-Catholic views. And when he returned to England, which was his home country, once again he was invested for the same thing, that he was an atheist. And yet, despite his unacceptable and offensive views at that time, he went on to change the entire political landscape and define the political science for the centuries to come. And I'm going to talk about briefly some of his works, and primarily about, in fact, Leviathan. And if you focus on the name, that comes from the Bible, and more specifically from the Old Testament book of Job, which is really, the Leviathan is a huge, terrifying sea monster. And here that name is given to the state, and not really in that negative manner, but I'll tell you about it. So that's one major work and its underlying philosophy that I'm going to talk about. And similarly, his ideas you can find in other books called The Citizen, On Matter, and the one called On Man. So before we get into the discussion about his work, let's understand his primary concern, which is basically about how human beings, all of us, can live together and live peacefully, so that you don't interfere in my business, I don't interfere in yours, and yet we have a powerful structure called state. And Hobbes argues that the state needs to have really immense power so that you and I can live together, coexist in harmony. So for that Leviathan, that massive, powerful state, Hobbes begins his argument by saying that just like physics is able to predict and explain the behavior of physical objects by, let's say, appealing to the physical laws, so in the similar fashion, the behavior of a society, it can similarly be explained in terms of interactions of you and I. And then he goes on to question that what exactly are the principles that govern your and my interaction. When we interact with each other, what's the underlying principle? And one of the principles that he identifies is that of, he says that human beings, all of us, we have this powerful drive. We want to increase our happiness by satisfying our desires. But it can happen, which happens all the time, that your desire and my desires, they may come in conflict with each other. You and I can desire the same thing, same person, same thing, same job maybe. So in that case, conflicts will naturally arise. And what are we going to do in that case? So that's why we need to have a state, really powerful state, under which we can function. And at the same time, we fear that state, that we can't really take on its authority. And he very clearly says that nature can, if we just follow the natural laws, don't create this artificial state system, then we can really end up destroying each other. So that's where we need the social contract, which this term, this idea, you're going to find in a lot of Enlightenment philosophers and political thinkers, where they came up with this idea where you have the social contract. And I think this is a very crucial point, because all of us, we crave our freedom, we crave our rights, but so many times we miss the basic idea of living in a state. And the idea is we give up something in order to attain something else. So we give up some of our freedoms so that state can protect us and it can maintain law and order, and it can serve justice. So that is the social contract. So suppose each individual enters into a contract with all the rest to submit to this really powerful state. Now, each individual gives up some of their natural freedom in return for, as I said, the protection or the kind of facilities they are going to get from state. So such a social contract, it kind of legitimizes the power of the state and works for the benefit of all, but at the same time, it gives a lot of power in terms of physical power, the power of violence, the power of serving justice. And when we talk about that, it also gives the power to kill people, kill the criminals, imprison them. So we kind of outsourcing a lot of things that we have or we can collectively have to the state. And this is where it gets interesting, that because his insistence is so much on creating a powerful state, and some of you might identify that with communism or political left in some ways. And some of the people might argue that it can interfere with individual freedom. But the Hobbes argument is that we need stability in our society. We don't want people to cross their freedom, cross their limits, and we don't want people who are just battling for their survival. We want to help those people. So we need to bring people together, and we need them to agree on certain principles so that we submit to this powerful state, and this powerful state can take care of ourselves, and then all the other things, the sciences, the arts, all these things can flourish under that state. So the argument is like life is definitely and immeasurably better than it is in the state of nature, where the most powerful takes all the pie. So it's really interesting that when we get into politics, we see the nature in different light. We don't see it romantically. We see its influences on the society. So in nature, you don't have, in the natural world, in animals, you don't have social contracts like the state, the marriages, all those things which kind of give stability to us. And this is what all these philosophers have considered, and particularly Thomas Hobbes argued for this. He sees the barbaric nature of the nature, in fact. But that is really the starting point. And if we want to get deeper into his philosophy, his ideas, we should read his book. And I'm sure some of you are going to try.